A week ago, we started a two-part mini-series on a hypothetical Chinese assault on Singapore. Do check out part 1 for the air and naval fights, as well as the role of missiles in this scenario. 6 months into the war, China basically took care of the Singaporean Air Force, Navy and most of its air defenses. Ground troops would be ready to disembark onto Singapore. Allow us a shout out to the Conflict of Nations, which sponsored this video mini-series. You can learn more about the game at the end of this video. Anyway, during the initial weeks of the war, Singapore would mobilize every possible reservist. Various paramilitary forces would also likely fight alongside those troops, be they police or volunteer corps units. Singapore's reservist system is pretty demanding, which should result in fairly competent reservist units. After 2 years of initial military service, which is compulsory, soldiers transfer to the reserves. Then they are called upon to retrain some 10 times until they are 40 years old. Usually those training cycles take a few weeks. Those plentiful forces would meet the smaller Chinese assault force. But China would not go for the mainland island. China's best bet might be going for the smaller Singapore islands first. It would try to negate most communication between those islands via air power. While tiny boats carrying a few men or boxes of supplies would be hard to observe and stop in time, larger ships carrying vehicles would eventually be neutralized by China's airplanes. Singapore might be forced to distribute their troops beforehand to all those islands, which would risk leaving fewer troops defending the main island. It would also risk those small island troops getting cut off from supplies, as islands lack infrastructure to support a big force. Or Singapore might choose to man those islands fairly lightly, in order to preserve most of their fighting force on the mainland. Those islands are still so close that artillery and even some mortar fire could be covering them. Of course, when Singaporean artillery would fire, that would make it easier for China to track it down. Basically, China might be forced to sacrifice the lives of some of their soldiers so they could slowly track and hunt down Singaporean artillery. Singapore would also use its attack helicopters. Another area where Singapore is very vulnerable is its infrastructure and supplies. Singapore imports 90% of its food. A lot of that food is going to stop coming in, as China essentially shuts down Singapore's ports with airstrikes and destroys the bridges and causeways to Malaysia. Singapore gets roughly half its drinking water from various plants and reservoirs. Power plants are similar fixed location targets, as are big oil depots and refineries. All of those would inevitably get destroyed, as all those present a finite set of targets. Organizing a long-term defense would become quite problematic in such an environment. China would eventually attempt one massive combined aerial and amphibious landing, but only after half a year of softening up Singapore's defenses. Without suppressing the defenders and preparing the terrain, troops parachuting or disembarking on islands would likely be quickly slaughtered. Essentially, that means that the blockade of the islands to starve the defenders is not enough. Each of those islands would have to be flattened with repeated artillery and bomb strikes. Not just to neutralize Singaporean troops, but also to neutralize as many mines as possible, which Singapore would surely place. Naval mines would also block the sea approaches to the islands. Lots of Chinese unmanned naval drones, minesweeping boats and maybe some landing craft would be lost. Airborne assaults too would have to wait until the path for an amphibious assault is clear, so firepower can be concentrated. While China has many transport planes, only the bigger ones could reach far enough. Of course, some of the fleet would always have to be under maintenance, so not all of these planes would be available. Larger planes could operate from the Chinese mainland, while the Y-8 and Y-9 planes would have to use the island bases closer by. China's airborne corps is 30 to 35,000 troops strong, with 6 airborne brigades. Almost 9,000 troops could be paradropped alongside some 120 fighting vehicles, but due to very small and crowded drop areas, it's possible the accent would be on paratroopers and not vehicles. Eventually though, sometime well past the 6 months mark, China would be in a position where it would be closely monitoring the situation on pretty much all of Singaporean land, almost in real time. It has plenty of recon satellites, which would have little trouble concentrating on such a small target set, enabling updates on an hourly basis. Long-range loitering recon drones that fly outside the reach of any surviving SAMs would augment the situational awareness even further. Basically, when the time comes to perform the landings, China would do so based on pretty accurate intel and choose the sites carefully. There would still be massive casualties for the Chinese, as not all defenders on islands could be neutralized beforehand, not all mines could be located, and most of the artillery and mortars would still be hidden on other islands by that point and only then unleash hell on the incoming attackers. China's amphibious assault fleet grew quite a bit in recent years. Discarding the smaller ships unusable for reaching Singapore, China would be left with 38 fairly capable vessels. Altogether, those could carry some 12,000 troops with their equipment. It's plausible that, combined with the airborne assault, China would manage to land almost 20,000 troops within hours, supported by a few hundred light combat vehicles, as well as some attack helicopters and 20-something destroyers providing shore bombardment support. Those could be positioned outside most of Singapore's artillery reach. The geography of the strait, however, means that any Chinese ship going for the southern islands would first be exposed to Singaporean artillery and even possibly Hellfire missile attacks and indirect fire from tanks from the mainland. China would most definitely suffer heavy losses even just approaching the islands. The first airborne assaults might even end with a loss, unable to fully establish control. China would still need to press on with its navy and perhaps even risk more of their ships closer by, so they can more easily monitor the waters between islands and try to sink even the small rubber boats. Helicopters would be used a lot for that, which also means dozens of helicopters lost due to Singaporean shoulder-launched missiles. While the second amphibious assault wave would have to wait for days, the second airborne assault wave might come within several hours. By the end of the first day, China might land almost 40,000 troops on islands holding fewer opponents. Considering its tiny size, Singapore's army has found room for a massive number of various armored vehicles. There is a wide discrepancy in the number of some models, so it is likely a lot of these have been retired or stored as army reserves. No matter the actual number, it's evident the Chinese would be met with a lot of firepower once they start landing on Singapore's soil. After days or weeks of hunting for Singaporean big guns and vehicles, eventually Singapore would be almost devoid of its heavy firepower edge over the Chinese troops. But by that time, China would have lost tens of thousands of troops and possibly a few dozen various ships. Ultimately, after a few weeks of heavy fighting for the outer islands, China would be controlling several of those, and Singapore would be left without firepower to harass those islands. From then on, it would be game over for Singapore. China would amass heavy firepower on those islands, perhaps even additional helicopters, and take more and more islands, probably in mere weeks. Aggregating troops over time, China would have further tens of thousands of troops and would bring many smaller landing craft and even take the Tekong Island. Singapore would be absolutely exhausted by then, with long periods without enough food, water, electricity and fuel. It's plausible it would eventually surrender, rather than face another wave of attacks on its mainland, now forced to use mostly infantry weapons. By that point, China would likely have lost several times, if not 10 times more troops than Singapore. But going forward, exhaustion might mean Singapore might fare even worse than China, which would now have multiple points to attack from. End result, Chinese victory, but an extremely bloody one. And all this would likely not be possible just 10 years ago, back when China lacked those South China Sea bases, when it lacked half of the aerial refueling fleet, a good deal of modern fighters, transports and large amphibious ships. Not to mention the big additions in drones, satellites and standoff missile inventories. Nope, we didn't forget about Conflict of Nations. If you want to try it out, go ahead, the link is in the description below the video, and it's free to play. But really the best thing about it is that you play against other human players. You pick a real country and lead it through thick and thin. Matches are played in real time, so every decision counts. But it's not a clickfest, far from it. Attacking a neighboring country will take hours of actual time. Battles may last for days. The pace is methodical and you've got time to make alliances with other players, and there can be up to 128 other humans, each leading a real country. Anyway, give it a try. Conflict of Nations has a gift for new players. Click that link in the description and get a starter package, 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. And remember, Binkov may talk about hypothetical wars, but only real peace can bring us all together.